Secondly, the law of biogenesis, very similar in idea to what we've been talking about, but instead of talking about the universe and great things, it talks about specifically life. The law of biogenesis is very simple, just like the law of cause and effect. Oaks come from acorns, chickens come from eggs, puppies come from dogs. The law of biogenesis says that all life comes from other life of the same kind. If you go back here to Genesis chapter 1, you see the very same thing. Chapter 2, verse 11, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them. And it was so. If you come down to verse 21, God created the sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. Verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things and beasts of the earth after their kind. And it was so. God created life to reproduce. But every time life reproduces, it reproduces life of the same kind. Now, the law of biogenesis is not a Christian law. It's not a law that's been proposed by creationists. It's a law that has been simply observed in nature, and there has never been an exception. 150 years ago, it was not a recognized law. 150 years ago, in the 1860s, people believed in spontaneous generation. And I talked about this a couple of years ago when we talked about a lesson on this. People believed that when they left a piece of meat laying out somewhere and it got maggots in it, that the maggots spontaneously generated there. That life just arose there of a different kind of the meat. But then a man, I think Louis Pasteur, did an experiment where he took a jar and he put meat in it and he covered it with cheesecloth. And the maggots appeared in the cheesecloth and not in the meat, because it was coming from fly eggs. And he did several other things that disproved spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation has been disproved. And after Pasteur in the late 1800s, it was laughed at with scorn, the idea of spontaneous generation. I want to share a quote with you from George Wald, a Nobel laureate of Harvard University. And I don't know if I made these comments publicly. I think I did, but I definitely made them privately this morning. I talked about the abominable people, the fool who says there is no God for abominable reasons, and that people are intellectually dishonest on this point. Here's an example. Nobel laureate of Harvard University, the biologist George Wald. Here's what he says. Most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. I'm not making this up. This man literally says, and he is a world-renowned biologist, a professor at Harvard. He says, we've all reviewed and been satisfied that the hypothesis of spontaneous generation has been refuted, that it is proven false. And then he comes back and he says, in the same paragraph, a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. And the middle part explains why, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation. It's the only alternative explanation. The only alternative explanation to spontaneous generation is supernatural creation. Spontaneous generation has been disproved. And yet they say the hypothesis of special creation is unscientific. That's intellectually dishonest. It's intellectually fraudulent. And you should teach your kids that they don't have to take these people at their word, because they lie. They tell you things, tell you to believe things, and tell you they prove things which they know to be false.